Now, after covering some about the classification of psychology and the definition of psychology, we will move on to cover some about participants in psychological research. We have two kinds of participants in psychological research, including human beings or human participants. Either we study normal individuals or abnormal ones. And also we in our psychological studies we cover all the lifespan: infant, child, adolescent, adult, and old age. And humans used in about 92 to 93% of psychological experiments. The second type of participants in psychological research are animals. We have many kinds of animals that used in our psychological research, such as dogs in Pavlov experiments, classical conditioning theory, and other animals, for example, hamsters in Skinner's experiments, and so on. And animals is used in about 7 to 8% of psychological experiments. And animals help us to do some medical and other manipulation, experimental manipulation we cannot do with humans. For example, to cut an area in the brain and see what will happen in the human behavior. We cannot do that in the case of humans, but can do that with animals. But while we are studying animals, our aims is humans. So we study animals to get information and then try to apply this information in the case of humans to generalize to generalize this information to humans. So we study humans in an indirect way. But animal studies are inexpensive and available, and also through animal studies we can study the lifetime. We cannot do that in the case of human, and we can study multiple generations. Now, what about the ethics in psychological research? There are some ethical principles organize our rules in psychology. Organize our experiments, so our work combine professional work and ethical one. This is referred. These codes are referred to as ethical codes. And we have many ethical principles or ethical codes, which are the main domains of responsibility for consideration by researchers within the ethical code, such as some of these major ethical principles, such as respect, competence, responsibility, integrity. And in addition to that, participants must be voluntary. They are free to share in our participants, to participate in our psychological research or not, to share or not. They are free. Never ever we can coerce anyone to share in our psychological research or psychological participants, and they are free to withdraw anytime, no problem, and no deception, and the confidentiality should be guaranteed. This is some ethical principles that organize our rules in psychology and organize our experiments or psychological experiments. Now, I would like to recap or summarize what we covered till this moment. Number one, we covered some about the classification of psychology as a natural science, as a social science, a human science, a behavioral science, a life science. And then we defined the psychology, and we have two definitions for psychology. Number one, psychology is a scientific study of overt and covert behavior in humans and animals. And second one, psychology also can be defined as a science of behavior and the mental process that seeks to describe and explain aspects of human thoughts, feelings, perception, and actions Then we covered some about the two kinds of participants in psychological research, and as we said before, human participants used in about 92 to 93% of psychological experiments, while animals used in about 7 to 8% in psychological research. And through animals, we can obtain information that can be applied on the human participants. So through animals we study humans, but in an indirect way and in an economic way, because animal studies are inexpensive and they are available, and through animals we can do some manipulations we cannot do them in the case of humans, and we can study the lifetime and the multiple generation. Now we have to move to the question of what is the subject matter of psychology. And we will know that the subject matter of psychology involves three aspects. Number one, overt behavior, and we will define and explain what's overt behavior. Number two, covert behavior, and we will get some about covert behavior. Number three, some biological and physiological or biological aspects or variables that correlated with overt and covert behavior. We are not interested in biological and physiological variables or factors as they are, because we are not physiologists, we are psychologists. So we are not interested in them as they are, but we are interested in the relationship between these biological, physiological factors and overt or covert behavior. So the subject matter of psychology involves three main aspects, and we will explain each one. Number one, overt behavior. Number two, covert behavior. Number three, biological and physiological aspects of overt and covert behavior, or biological or physiological factors that correlated with overt and covert behavior. Overt behavior. The first one of the subject matter of psychology is referred to as overt behavior. As you know, overt is an adjective which refers to something which is clearly apparent, obvious, public, noticeable. And this is what we mean by overt behavior. Overt behavior can be defined as an observable behavior or responses that will be in the form of actions. Now we can define it as, this is the definition of overt behavior. It refers to responses that are directly observable. Take care, because if we are talking about indirectly observable, in that case we mean covert behavior, but overt behavior is behaviors are directly observable. And we have three types of overt behavior. Number one, motor activities. Number two, verbal reports or verbal communication. Number three, non-verbal communication. So we have three subtypes of overt behavior. Motor activities, including walking, running, all our motor activities or motor acts, walking, running, jumping, going upstairs, downstairs, all gross motor acts and fine motor behavior or fine motor acts. And I'm sure you know the difference between motor, gross motor and fine motor behaviors or acts. Gross motor, like as walking, running, jumping, going upstairs, downstairs. But in fine motor acts or fine motor behaviors, we have to do some fine manipulations, especially not all of them, with your fingers, such as writing, drawing. These are referred to as fine motor acts or fine motor behaviors. Either we are talking about gross motor acts or fine motor acts, all of them are classified as motor activities, and the motor activities is the first subtype of overt behavior. Number two, verbal communication. We mean by verbal reports of verbal communication to express yourself by talking and speech. So you have to use language, any language. But the third type of overt behaviors is referred to as non-verbal communication. Non-verbal, not verbal, non-verbal. And it is also referred to as body language, such as eye contact, body posture, personal space, facial expressions, any signs or signal that can use to express yourself. But in the case of non-verbal communication, you don't use language. You use signs or signals to express your self. So, three subtypes of overt behavior. Overt behavior refers to responses that are directly observable, and we have three subtypes of overt behavior: motor activities, verbal communication, and non-verbal communication. And all of these three subtypes studied in psychology. And they are studied in relation to other concepts such as personality, thinking, psychological disorder, and so on. The second type the second issue in the subject matter of psychology is covert behavior. Covert behavior. Covert behavior, the definition of covert behavior says it refers to events that take place within an individual. Because they take place within or happen within the individual, they are private and internal, and you cannot directly observe them. What about the examples of this covert behavior? Examples include feelings, emotions, moods, motives, needs, attitudes, beliefs, thinking or thoughts, imagination, creativity, even personality traits. They are private and internal. You cannot observe them directly. But if we able to infer them from overt behavior, we will be indirectly observable. So you can infer your feelings from your verbal reports. If I say I am very happy now, or from my facial expression, or if I am very anxious, so I move much. In that case, my motor activity express my anxiety, and we can infer my anxiety from my motor activities. Now, if you will try to compare between overt and covert behavior, and if I ask you about the difference between, or if I ask you to make a comparison between overt and covert behavior, you can say that in overt behavior, it refers to responses that are directly observed. But covert behavior, it refers to events happen within the individual, take place within the individual, and they are private and internal. And the word covert refers to something which is not openly acknowledged or displayed. So they are secret, behind the scenes. So they are private and internal events. And you cannot observe them directly, but you can observe them if you would be able to convert them into overt behavior. What about the examples of each one? Overt behavior are such as motor activities, overt and covert behaviors, verbal communication, and nonverbal communication. But examples of covert behavior are like as feelings, emotions, moods, motives, attitudes, thinking, intelligence, personality traits, imagination, and so on. So to sum and to conclude, overt is an adjective refers to something which is clearly apparent, obvious, public, noticeable, and overt behavior can be defined as observable behavior or responses that are in the form of actions, while the word covered refers to something which is not acknowledged or displayed. They are secret, behind the scenes, they are private and internal, and in order to study them, we have to convert them into overt behavior. If we would be able to do that, in that case, we will be able to observe covert behavior, but in direct way, and we can measure them. While we are defining psychology, we said that psychology is scientific study of mental processes. What do we mean by mental processes? Mental processes, it is like such as thoughts, ideas, as well as more complex aspects of reasoning and all cognitive functions that such as creativity, intelligence, memory, learning, perception, attention, thinking, abstraction, and so on. All of this intelligence also is a mental processes. All of this is a definition of mental processes. And as we said before, in order to study psychology means that you learn how humans and other organisms think, how they understand, learn, perceive, feel, how they act, and interact with others. In that case, we are talking about social interaction. And because psychology includes social issues as well as biological issues, psychology is classified as a natural science and as a social science. As we said before, the subject matter of psychology involves three aspects. Number one, overt behavior, covert behavior, and the third one is physiological and biological aspects of the behavior. These physiological variables are studied in a branch of psychology referred to as physiological psychology, and in another branch is referred to as neuropsychology and biological psychology. Physiological psychology is a subdivision or division of behavior neuroscience or biological psychology that studies the neural and the physiological mechanisms of the behavior. Either we are talking about overt behavior and covert behavior. For example, it explains behavior in physiological terms, in which side of the brain, in which, for example, in which side of the brain memory is localized. In which side I am talking about the localization of the memory in the brain. So in physiological and biological factors, we are not interested in the physiological and biological factors as they are, but we are interested in how are they correlated with overt and covert behavior. And these changes, physiological changes or physiological factors are such as heart rate, blood pressure, secretion of saliva, electrical conductivity of the skin or GSR. All of these variable we are not interested in them as they are, but we are interested in their correlation with behavior. how they are correlated with the behavior, the relationship between these physiological factors and these physiological or biological factors and psychological factors. This relation is our focus in psychology. So we are not interested in the brain itself, but we are interested in the relationship between brain and the behavior. For example, brain and the memory, brain and the intelligence, brain and the personality, brain and the aggressive behavior. So the relationship is our main focus, not the brain itself. We are interested in are not interested in the heart rate, blood pressure, secretion of saliva as they are, but we are interested in the relationship between these three variables and phobia, for example. Because phobia is characterized by increasing in heart rate, blood pressure, but decreasing in secretion of saliva. So we are interested in these factors, and they, or mainly, we are interested in the relationship between these factors and the psychological factors. So our subject matter of psychology involves three aspects. Number one, overt behavior. Number two, covert behavior. And as we said before, overt behavior refers to responses that are directly observable. And the covert behavior, which can be defined as unobservable behavior, which leads to certain actions. And the third one, the physiological factors that are correlated with our behavior, either overt behavior or covert behavior. One main issues in the psychology is the relationship or the difference, between nature or biology and the nurture or environment. The difference between biological factors and environmental factors. I mean by environmental factors mainly experience and learning. What is the interaction between these two variables? Early in the 20th century, researchers emphasized on the role of biological factors. For example, they emphasize on the role of biological factors in intelligence, on intelligence. But between 16s and 17s, they moved on to the other side, and they believe that environmental factors are the most important than the biological factors. But now we are believing in that the interaction between biological and environmental factors is the main issue. So we are now studies how the interaction between these biological factors, your makeup. What about the biological factors? And I mean by environmental factors, learning and experience, education, all of these factors. So now we believe that we have in each trait, in each psychological trait, we have some sort of interaction between biological factors and environmental factors. You should know that the focus of psychology is generally on the individual, whether alone. So our main subject in psychology is the human. Either he is alone or in interaction with others and the environment. So we are interested in the individual traits, characteristics, abilities, skills. Either he is alone or while he is in an interaction with others. So we also study the social interaction, and we are interested in social interaction. And psychology as a science have to benefit from other science. Any science can give some insights into the human behavior Psychology have to benefit from it in explaining the human behavior, in describing human behavior, in predicting and controlling human behavior. So psychology benefits from computer science. For example, in computer science, we take the model of inputs, outputs, and in between processing. This is the way the computer do his activities. We have inputs and we have outputs, and in between we have processing. It's the same in our minds as a human being. We have input, it is referred to as a stimuli, and we have output, it is referred to as our responses, and in between we have processing, but in that case we don't have electronic processing, but we have mental and intellectual processing. Psychology also benefit or profit from sociology, anthropology, biology. We cannot study for example, the relationship between the physiological and the biological factors and the behavior if we and we know nothing about the biological and the physiological changes in our bodies. So we know some about them and then think about the relationship between these factors and our behaviors. Now the question is psychology is a science? Of course, we define psychology as a scientific study, and because it is a scientific study, psychology is a science. Why? Why is psychology a science? Psychology is a science because psychology applying is a scientific method. So the study of psychology, when you apply the scientific method, you will be exact and systematic. So the psychology will be exact and systematic because it applies the scientific method. But what is the definition of scientific method? What do we mean by scientific method? This is the definition of scientific method. Scientific method is a basic strategy that is carefully designed to ensure that reliable facts are established. So we can gain facts about human behavior are established, and observation or experiments can be replicated by independent and other investigators, other researchers. Again, the definition of scientific method is a basic strategy that's carefully designed to ensure that reliable facts can be established and the observation or experiments can be replicated by independent investigators and other investigators. And because psychology uses or applies the scientific method, the psychological research can produce information in topics like as how people grow up and they become independent. So we have developmental psychology, and how they learn, remember, sleep, and dream, perceive the world, live fulfilling lives. So we have personality or psychology of personality and the cognitive psychology, how they interact. So we have social psychology. And what about behavioral problems such as aggression, drug abuse, and so on? What about the psychological factors and social factors that correlated with these behavioral problems? And what about the assessment and the treating mental and psychological disorders, psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia, depression, phobia, post-traumatic disorder, anxiety, hysteria, manic depressive disorder, and so on? And what about the different kind of disabilities such as mental retardation, or which referred to as intellectual disability, and syndromes that may be have comorbidity with intellectual disabilities such as autistic spectrum disorder, ADHD, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and so on. All of these questions can be studied or can be answered by the psychological research. How? By applying the scientific method. Now, I would like to recap or summarize what we covered till this moment. Firstly, we classified psychology in 5 basic categories, as we said before. It could be behavioral science, life science, social science, natural science, human science. And then we defined the psychology in 2 ways. Number 1, we defined it as a scientific study of overt and covert behavior in humans and animals. Then we defined it as a science of behavior and the mental process. And I gave you some examples about the mental process, such as perception, learning, attention, intelligence, memory, reasoning, abstraction. And psychology seeks to describe and explain aspects of human thoughts, feelings, perception, and actions, and all the human characteristics or human traits. Then we covered some about participants in psychological research, human being and animals and animal participants, and we already know some about ethics in psychological research, such as participation are free to share or not, they are free to withdraw any time, confidentiality is guaranteed, no deception, and so on. Then we said that our subject matter of psychology involves 3 aspects. Number 1, overt behavior, which is directly observable, and the covert behavior, which are private and internal, and we can infer them if we would be able to convert them into overt behavior. And the third type of subject matter of psychology, physiological and biological factors. And as we said before, we are not interested in the physiological and the biological factors as they are, but we are interested in the relationship between these factors and psychological factors or psychological variables. And psychology can benefit from other science, and we differentiate between nature or biology versus nurture and the environment. And we mean by environment the learning, experience, education, socialization, but we mean by biological factors hormones, genes, chromosomes, and so on, all your makeup. And the last point, we answers the question, is psychology is a science? For sure it is a science, because it applies the scientific method. So the study of psychology could be exact and systematic. And we define the scientific method as a method carefully, or strategy, basic strategy that is carefully designed to ensure that reliable facts are established and observation or experiments can be replicated by other or independent investigators. And because psychology applies the scientific method, psychology can answer all questions about the human being, including his development, his cognitive abilities, his social interaction, his behavioral problems, his psychological and psychiatric disorder, his disabilities, different disabilities. All the questions included in these topics in the human life can be answered in psychology.